Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. A week today is qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix. The first time we are truly going to be able to tell what the performance of these cars actually looks like on track. The following day is the race. Somebody's going to win it, and McLaren and Lando Norris, as it stands, are most certainly the favourites. But every team is trying to figure out, okay, we may be behind McLaren, but what is the deficit as it stands, especially because Bahrain, where they looked so strong in the test, is not typically one of McLaren's better circuits. There are concerns, certainly from Red Bull. The gap they had to McLaren has actually increased over the winter period, and it ranges somewhere between 0.3 and a whole seconds a lap in terms of performance. Surely this can't be possible on the final year of a regulation cycle, but if it is, there's no doubt one of the McLaren drivers is going to win this year's Drivers' World Championship. Who's it going to be, if it is any of them at all? Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always. I greatly appreciate it. We are going to begin here because there's lots to talk about the Cadillac team arriving into Formula 1 for 2026. They need a couple of drivers. Is Mick Schumacher on the radar? I don't really think so. He is driving, I think, in Sydney right now at the Race of Champions. Don't think he's having the best time of it out there. Look, he's still talking to the media about it. Ralf Schumacher's still going to be talking to the media about it. The reality is it's unlikely, to such an extent, actually, that F1 did this graphic saying, oh, who's going to get the Cadillac drive? Here are plenty of drivers that are out of a drive. And, yeah, Mick Schumacher isn't here. Now, they do say somebody else, question mark. But Ricciardo, I think Danny Rick has basically said he ain't coming back. That's the general feeling anyway. In the same way that Vettel has said that, but then there are rumours that Vettel still wants to return. I don't think that would be a good idea, nor do I think it's going to happen. I think Danny Rick is, you know, not happy with how everything ended, but I think maybe he's admitted, okay, like, it's time to move on from Formula 1. But if an opportunity arises, I think he would be unwise to not consider it. Bottas is certainly a driver that I think I would go for if I was in Cadillac's position. But then again, if you're going to get Bottas, maybe you think, well, do we just get a younger potential rookie driver with some talent and get Perez instead? Because Perez, of course, is going to be big in the Americas. That's an option. Tsunoda has to be considered because, as we saw yesterday, Honda are in the position saying, look, Yuki, you might have to find your own way, and Red Bull are probably going to say the same. There's also Guan Yu Zhou. We know that General Motors, Cadillac, they will want to make some progress in China. Audi probably will feel the same way at some point. That's an opportunity. Is he the best option? I don't really think so. Then to me, you've got some of the more exciting options. I'll be honest, if I was making the decision just from a pure what I'd like to see perspective, I'm putting Alex Palou in the car. He's been destroying the IndyCar Championship over the last couple of years, given how incredibly competitive that series has been. He's been linked to a couple of Formula 1 opportunities in the past. Neither of those opportunities, if any of them, have ever come to light. And, you know, it's not like Palou is a young driver necessarily. He's in his late 20s, I believe. But he has been, you know, doing things in the IndyCar series that are very rarely done in a championship so competitive. I'd really love to see how he'd get on a Formula 1 car. Colton Herta is an exciting prospect as well. Bit younger, bit rawer, maybe. But potentially a little bit too dangerous, maybe, to put in the car for Cadillac's perspective, but he's American. Palou is Spanish, despite racing in an American series right now. But certainly these are some of the front runners for at least one of those seats going into 2026. There was a bit of drama as well. So Gary Anderson, kind of the technical, like basically editor, let's say, for the race, and used to be an engineer and all this type of stuff, not the darts player. As some of you guys, well, when I think Gary Anderson, I think of the Scottish darts player, but no, not this time. But he said that Colton Herta would not be his pick. He makes too many mistakes. He's definitely got speed. I don't know that he's got speed and the mental capacity to pick up Formula 1, says Gary Anderson. Now, whether you agree or not, I'm interested to know what you think. But Alexander Rossi, IndyCar driver, kind of one of Colton's peers in some respects, says, who even is this Gary Anderson guy? So Alexander Rossi always giving it out on social media. There was also this pretty fascinating clip actually emerging yesterday. So Lando, of course, going into the new season with, let's be honest here, he is being considered by most as the favourite for this year's World Drivers' Championship. That carries a great degree of pressure alongside it. Lando is pretty clear during Drive to Survive that he's going to be able to get on top of this, as in he will take his mentality that he currently has and he will be able to execute on that to win the championship. Whether you think that's fair or not fair is a question, but Lando believes that he can be the way that he is and still win the championship. There's been lots of debate over the last few years as to whether especially last year, Max has a different approach, shall we say, than Lando does, generally speaking, to winning in Formula 1. That ruthless absolutely win at all costs mentality that Lando doesn't necessarily seem to have. But I think Lando will have been battle sharpened to some degree by having the championship battle with Max the most recent season. You might argue, was it really a championship battle? Okay, maybe not. But it was at least on at some point, and maybe another driver in that position would have won the championship, who knows? But Lando was asked the question, like, you know, if you had to leave McLaren, where would you go? And okay, the answer is obvious, but it's still interesting to hear him say it. I can't answer that one. I know exactly which one I'd love to go to. It's the team that everyone wants to be a part of at some point in their career, but I'm very happy with McLaren. Very diplomatic of you. You know, obviously he's talking about Ferrari, right? Like everyone wants to drive for that team at some point. Just interesting to think about. If Lando does go on and wins titles with McLaren, maybe an option for Ferrari in the coming years at some point. But I think if you're Ferrari, you're probably thinking, okay, Hamilton's going to be around 2, 3, 4 seasons, who knows? And after that, maybe they got Ollie Behrman if he's good enough. I think Leclerc will likely be at Ferrari until time immemorial, to be honest. And speaking of Leclerc, we do have some pretty fascinating images coming out of Formula 1 today. So I don't think all the drivers got involved in this, like 14 of them got involved in this. There was no Hamilton, there was no Verstappen, there was no Alonso, there was no Stroll, maybe Ocon's not on here either. Try and figure out who the other driver is that's not appearing here, because I was having to think about it real quick and I couldn't quite figure it out. But yeah, Lando says, season number 7, sleeping in my future dog. This year I'll be 1 year older. So kind of nice to go through this, right? Obviously, here's Kimi Antonelli. I mean, he is very young, but like it's so funny, like looking at that team. He just looks like such a kid, which he is, obviously. But it's still really exciting, I think, to see how Antonelli gets on, especially because there's these storylines, aren't there, around how he's going to fare against some of the other drivers in the sport. The fact that we're going to Australia as well, of course, the first round of the season, the scene of when Lewis Hamilton famously went round the outside of Fernando Alonso at turn 1 to kind of announce his arrival into the sport. And it's not like Mercedes should be uncompetitive this year based on what we saw back in Bahrain. This is Leclerc's one, though. F1 season number 8 from Monaco. I love Leo, of course. His dog talks about his music and then says, this year I will be a world champion. Now, I don't know if they've done this in previous years. I don't really think that they have. Leclerc is always a very confident guy, but still, I think he's the only guy who put on this that he's going to be a world champion this year. So maybe indicate some degree of confidence in the car, in the machine, in his abilities to make that happen. But I mean, look, maybe he means world constructors champion. I don't know, but I don't really think that's what he's getting at there. This is Russell's as well. He talks about returning the T-pose back in business. We've got you know, Gabriel Bortoletto. We've got the one from Jack Doohan as well, who likes racing cars, and he'll be a Formula 1 driver at least for some length of time. We're not really sure. This is Carlos Sainz, I thought was pretty good as well, and there's a few others that I'll just kind of quickly go through here because most of the key ones that were causing some attention and some controversy, such as Pedro Gasly, we've already mentioned, right? But yeah, this was the Hadjar one. We had Tsunoda, we had, of course, Nico Hülkenberg as well, rounding things out. But yeah, if Max can get out of doing stuff like this, it seems like he will. Probably the same story for Hamilton as well. And the other driver, Liam Lawson, of course, not featured here. So both of the Red Bull guys, both of the Aston Martin guys, no Hamilton and no Ocon, I believe, are the ones that we didn't get to see. Whether Verstappen will still be a Red Bull man next year is a bit of a question mark. Jos Verstappen, it's funny, isn't it? Like the way that F1 works, because we kind of know, at least we're pretty confident, Jos Verstappen has had serious conversations with Mercedes about Max going there at some point, and I imagine that remains at some point in his mind because of the rumours about Mercedes engine being the best next year and all this stuff. But when this was pitched to Jos, he said, nonsense, don't know what you're talking about. I'm sure the conversations will still be being had, especially if Red Bull don't start the season especially well, and if, let's say, Mercedes do. Now, let's talk Ferrari and where they might be with respect to, let's say, McLaren and the other teams. Ferrari definitely have issues. Now, every team has issues. The car's never perfect in any way. Even the McLaren, they've talked about the rear instability, trying to get that solved going into the start of the season. Now, Ferrari, their car has some weaknesses. There was a feeling that maybe they were holding more back than some of the other teams were. Who knows if that's actually true or not? Were they really sandbagging? I'm tempted to say no. I think they've got some issues to solve. At the end of the day, they radically changed their front suspension geometry. It's pretty inevitable there will be some teething issues. I think Ferrari's realization was if they stick with last year's fundamental design, they're not going to be able to overtake McLaren. They might be good enough to win, the constructors in that way, but having the best car was going to take some radical innovation to some extent. And maybe that was accepting they were not going to be the strongest car at the start of the season. That was likely to be the McLaren, but giving themselves a higher overall concept ceiling. And there is a feeling that Ferrari are giving more to 2025, given the big regulation changes looming, than the other teams are. So maybe this is going to work out for Ferrari. As long as they're not that far off the pace, as long as they're close enough to score podiums bare minimum, then they'll be fine, I think, potentially in terms of fighting for the World Championship, both World Championships at that. But there is still a lingering concern among myself and many of the teams that maybe McLaren are just like incredibly good. It would be a surprise, let's be honest, right? Finally, you're the regulations. You're thinking everything comes close together. But McLaren, they said it during the off-season, in the winter break. McLaren were sitting there saying, look, guys, we are trying to make this year's World Championship boring. We don't want to fight. We want to drive away with the victory race after race after race and make it a 2023 repeat. That seems incredibly unlikely to me, with various factors in play. But it is possible that McLaren have taken a lot of risk with this car. They've changed their own front suspension geometry to some degree, increasing the level of anti-dive. And it seems like, in terms of degrading the tyres, it just doesn't do it. And that was a concern for other teams seeing it around Bahrain, because that's not typically one of McLaren's best tracks. And if they're struggling with some rear instability, you're going to get that at Bahrain. You're not necessarily going to get that so much in more front-limited circuits, such as Melbourne, that we are going to very shortly indeed. And Marco says from Red Bull, they believe, Red Bull, I think, that they are seconds or in that kind of ballpark. They know they've got losses to McLaren, but Marco says Ferrari is the third strongest team, then Mercedes, according to their calculations. So we'll see what happens when we get to the track, because everyone has a different opinion on this. Red Bull have said, though, that McLaren's change is risky in their opinion, because Mercedes have maybe worked around stuff like this. It is a bit different what McLaren have done to what Mercedes have done, but in the same way that Ferrari have changed their geometry, McLaren have made a pretty radical adjustment as well, and maybe that's, yielding them fewer downsides than what Ferrari are presently experiencing. But the big talking point of the day really was around the amount of lap time we might be talking about here, because as I've said, it would be very surprising if McLaren are really an absolutely dominant machine, but it's not completely impossible. We've heard Red Bull, McLaren, and even Mercedes, we're going to see in a second, say that, yeah, their cars are good, but they're not exactly perfect. Neither is the McLaren, but there is concern about this, because McLaren, everyone you ask, they'll tell you that the McLaren is the fastest car, but is it the fastest car by a tenth in qualifying? Is it the fastest car by a tenth in race trim? Because if it is, it's very much World Championship on, of course. But if it's a second a lap faster, as sometimes the Red Bull has been over the last couple of years, then, chalk it up, right? Like, there's no way you're going to be able to manage that, surely. And it would also, if Lando was to have a completely dominant car, then the pressure that he might be under might be lessened to some extent, because he's not really racing anyone, apart from maybe his own teammate. So the projections on this apparently range the delta somewhere between 0.3 of a second up to an entire second of lap time performance, which is pretty insane. Marco says the gap is smaller than that, but this is AMUS, right? This is probably the most reputable source we have in Formula 1, saying that according to what the teams are coming up with, the gap is big, like it's substantial right now, certainly in terms of race trim. Marco says it's probably not that big, and they didn't get the run-in that they exactly wanted to, but there is concern that the McLaren's tyre deg was sensationally low, speaking for a car that slips little because the tyres degrade when the car slides around. If the car's super planted, you don't tend to get that. And McLaren do like to drive with higher downforce. That has been a trend. They'll take the slower straight line speed in exchange of better downforce, which, prepares the tyres better, keeps them alive better and stuff like this. But there is a concern because McLaren at Bahrain has been pretty woeful the last few years, right? It's not been a good track for them. They turned up there for the test and were the strongest car. So that is a concern. And there's also concern that Norris is still complaining about something, because you guys remember last year's test. Red Bull did not win last year's World Constructors' Championship, but Max at last year's test was saying this car's perfect, does everything I want. Norris is saying, we can make this better, guys. And that's a bit concerning for others when the car is already significantly better. They do go on to say, behind McLaren, who knows? They think Red Bull might be seconds. certainly with Max, I think like that might be my opinion as well, is that, okay, McLaren are the best. I don't know where Red Bull are, but a Verstappen-driven Red Bull, you know, you've got to think third is an opportunity at bare minimum, really. Then Ferrari, then Mercedes. That's the feeling. Alpine and Williams, strongest of the midfield. Then Racing Bulls, then Haas, then Sauber, and Aston Martin, nobody knows. The car is apparently easier to drive, but they haven't become any faster. So yeah, that's what AMUS believe. Intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. But, you know, there's been discussion from other sources as well that Red Bull are a bit concerned that their gap to McLaren might have actually got worse over the winter break, which would be impressive for McLaren to have achieved given the fact that they've had less testing time, right? I mean, coming into this season with limited development time compared to some of the other teams because they're in the position they are in the championship. So, look, we're only really going to know when the cars turn up to the track. It's just, we're hoping, I guess, this isn't clearly the case, unless you're a Lando Norris or an Oscar Piastri fan, that the McLaren is by far the fastest car, because on paper this should be one of the greatest seasons ever in Formula 1 history. And with the exception of the McLaren looking really, really good, we don't know what that's going to look like right now. But everyone is obviously saying that Lando is potentially the favourite. There's been talk about the W16 as well. Russell, though, did say that, you know, he's confident for the first race, but he doesn't think they're necessarily going to be fighting for the victory immediately in the same way that, you know, the McLaren looks like it's going to be the strongest machine. What does it mean, though, for the Drivers' World Championship? These were the predictions of the F1 2025 readers for Planet Formula 1, and they came up with the following: 32.5% for Norris, 24% for Verstappen, then Hamilton, then Leclerc, then Piastri, right? So I think a pretty interesting assessment of where people feel like the dynamic at McLaren potentially is, because, I mean, look, if the car is as good as people fear that it may be, then Piastri has a much higher percentage chance than any of these other guys, excluding, of course, Lando Norris. But that may not be what actually happens when the car hits the track. And, of course, Piastri will be incredibly motivated to start the season out the right way as far as he sees it, because, you know, they're turning up to Australia, his home Grand Prix, and this is a genuinely excellent opportunity for him to potentially win it. And those opportunities may not come along often. Who knows in 2026 whether the competitive picture changes substantially. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. That comment I was mentioning earlier here from Russell was this, that they were struggling, Mercedes, with some low-speed understeer last year, and he says there are still some signs of that, but they're trying to get on top of it, but they've got some ideas that they can potentially fix the issues. So, yeah, every team is struggling, even McLaren are, but McLaren are certainly quietly confident about their potential for the new year. But Leclerc thinks he can be the world champion. Hamilton feels the same way. Of course, Ferrari are always going to be, you know, having uncapped confidence about their potential performance, but what's actually going to happen, time will only tell. So as I say, a week today, it will be qualifying in Australia, and a week tomorrow, we'll already know the outcome of the Grand Prix and where the season lies. Because, you know, at the end of 2013, going into the substantial changes for 2014, things were pretty competitive until Vettel won the final 9 Grand Prix of the year when the Red Bull was the fastest car, with everyone focusing on 2014. This time around, if McLaren start out great, the other teams might have to say, well, the championship's over, we're going to focus on next year, leaving it to be free reign potentially for Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri. But will they be able to execute? But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.